You know, we use names all the time, right? Like Alex, London, whatever. We just use them.
Yeah, they just work.
But what if that whole process, just naming something, is actually way deeper and more complicated than it looks?
It definitely is. What if it touches on these huge questions about, like, what's real, what could be real?
That's exactly the rabbit hole we're jumping into today.
Right. We're looking at excerpts from Saul Kripke's Naming and Necessity. This was seriously influential stuff in philosophy. Really shook things up.
Based on lectures he gave back in 1970, right?
Exactly. Informal lectures, which was kind of unusual then, but hugely important for philosophy of language metaphysics, how we even think about meaning.
Naming and necessity. It sounds kind of grand, maybe a bit abstract.
Well, yeah, but Kripke's trying to get clear on how a name actually hooks onto the thing it names.
And why should we care about that link?
Because it digs into these fundamental distinctions like things that had to be true versus things that just happen to be true.
Okay, necessity versus contingency.
Yeah, and what we can know for sure versus what we just believe, and just the basic nature of meaning itself. It's about understanding language, the tool we think with.
Sharpening the tools, I like that.
And the fact these are lecture transcripts is interesting too. Kripke's style was very conversational, very direct.
And you never wrote the book on it later?
Nope. These lectures, transcribed and lightly edited, are pretty much the main source for these incredibly powerful ideas.
And you mentioned implications. It's not just word games, is it?
Not at all. Understanding naming, how it works, how necessity works, it actually impacts how philosophers argue about totally different things.
Like what?
Like the mind-body problem. How does consciousness relate to the physical brain? Kripke's ideas about identity and necessity have been used to make arguments about whether that connection has to be there or if it's just, well, contingent.
Wow, okay. So from naming Nixon to the nature of consciousness, that's quite a leap.
It shows how fundamental these language issues are. And Kripke, he focuses mostly on proper names, like actual names for people, cities, countries.
So Saul Kripke, Princeton, USA.
Right. And he makes a big distinction between those and what he calls definite descriptions.
Like the philosopher who wrote Naming and Necessity.
Exactly. Or the tallest building in the city. Phrases where the description itself tells you what it refers to.
Okay. And he jumps straight into a fight, philosophically speaking.
Pretty much. He takes issue with John Stuart Mill, who thought names just point. They don't mean anything in themselves.
No connotation, just denotation.
Right. But even more, Kripke goes after the heavyweights, Frege and Russell. They had this influential idea that proper names are basically just disguised, definite descriptions.
Ah, okay. So Saul Kripke is just shorthand for the guy who wrote Naming and Necessity and gave those lectures or something like that.
That's the core of the Frege-Russell view, yeah.
Yeah.
The meaning of the name is some description, and the name refers to whoever or whatever uniquely fits that description.
Okay, that sounds sort of plausible on the face of it.
It does, but Kripke immediately asks, well, what if you don't have a unique description? How do you refer then?
Good point. Like, Julius Caesar. I know who he is, but maybe I don't have one single phrase that perfectly picks him out and only him.
Exactly. Russell tried to handle some cases with acquaintance, for things right in front of you, you can just point. But that obviously doesn't work for Caesar.
Can't point to Caesar now.
So Frege suggested that, well, our shared knowledge about Caesar, Roman general, crossed the Rubicon, assassinated, all that gives us a way to identify him descriptively.
Okay, the collection of facts acts like a description.
But this leads to puzzles. Think about Hesperus's phosphorus. Ancient astronomers use these names.
For Venus, right. Evening star and morning star.
Right. But if Hesperus just means the star seen in the evening, and phosphorus means the star seen in the morning, then discovering they're the same seems trivial, like saying the evening star is the evening star. But it wasn't trivial. It was an astronomical discovery.
Huh. Yeah, how can it be informative if the names just mean the descriptions and the descriptions pick out the same thing?
Frege's answer was clever. He said the sense or the description associated with each name is different. Evening star versus morning star, even if they happen to refer to the same object. That's where the informativity comes from.
The way of identifying it is different.
Exactly. And same for existence questions. If you ask, did Aristotle exist? On this view, you're really asking, did anyone uniquely fit the descriptions we associate with the name Aristotle?
Like the student of Plato, teacher of Alexander.
Or the Nicomachean Ethics, yeah, that sort of thing.
Okay, so that's the view Kripke's up against.
And he thinks basically that this whole description picture, Frege-Russell's view, is just wrong. Despite being super influential, He thinks it fundamentally misunderstands how names actually function.
So if the single description idea is shaky, what comes next? You mentioned a cluster concept theory.
Right, people like Searle and Ziff developed this idea. Maybe a name isn't tied to one single description, but to a whole cluster or family of them.
Okay, so Aristotle isn't just the teacher of Alexander. It's that plus student of Plato plus author of the metaphysics and so on. A whole bundle.
Exactly. And the name refers to whoever or whatever satisfies, say, enough of those descriptions, or maybe a weighted majority of the important ones.
I can see how that helps. With Hesperus and Phosphorus, they'd have different clusters, right? Seen in evening, brightest object then, versus seen in morning, last star to fade.
Precisely. Even if they point to the same planet, the associated clusters of information are different. It seems to explain informative identities better. And it still gives away the name hooks onto the world through satisfying enough of these descriptions.
Makes sense.
Now, there were sort of two ways people took this cluster idea. One is that the cluster is the meaning of the name. Saying Aristotle means the conjunction or collection of these properties.
Okay, definition by cluster.
The other way is maybe weaker. The cluster isn't the meaning, but it's how we fix the reference. It's the tool we use to figure out who we're talking about, even if the name itself doesn't strictly mean those things.
And Kripke's reaction? Still skeptical.
Yeah, he's still wary. He thinks some of the appeal is lost if the cluster doesn't actually give the meaning. For example, analyzing Moses might not have existed.
Right. If Moses means the guy who led the Israelites out of Egypt, received the tablets, etc., then saying he didn't exist is just saying nobody did all those things.
Exactly. But couldn't Moses have existed, but maybe, I don't know, someone else led the Israelites out? Or maybe none of that happened, but there was still a person named Moses who lived then.
It seems to bake too much history into the meaning of the name itself.
That's Kripke's worry. It risks making certain historical facts seem like they had to be true just because of how we use the name.
Okay, so we have these theories trying to link names and descriptions, but Kripke feels they're missing something fundamental. He then starts clarifying some concepts that often get mixed up, right? Like a priori and necessary.
Absolutely crucial distinction for him. A priori is epistemological. It's about how we know something. Traditionally, it's knowledge independent of experience. Think math. 2 plus 2 plus 4. You don't need to go out and check pairs of things.
You just know it through reason.
Right. But Kripke adds a nuance. He says it means it can be known independently of experience. You might learn a mathematical truth from a computer or a friend, which is experience. But the truth itself is the kind of thing knowable a priori.
Okay, so it's about the possibility of knowing it without experience, not how you specifically learned it.
Got it.
And necessary.
Necessary is metaphysical. It's about how the world is, or rather, how it must be. A necessary truth is true in all possible worlds, in all conceivable scenarios.
Like 2 plus 2 of 4 seems necessary. It's hard to imagine a world where it's false. But the fact that it's sunny today isn't necessary. It could easily be raining.
Exactly. It rained yesterday. That's true, but contingently true, not necessarily true. Kripke loves the Goldbach conjecture example.
The one about prime numbers.
Yeah, that every even integer greater than 2 is the sum of 2 primes. Mathematicians are pretty sure it's true, but haven't proven it definitively. Kripke says, look, it's either necessarily true, if it's true at all, it must be true in all possible mathematical structures, or it's necessarily false. But we don't know a priori which one it is. We need a proof.
So that really pulls necessity, a property of the truth itself, apart from a priori knowledge, how we know it. You can have one without the other.
Precisely. And then there's analytic, true by definition, like bachelors are unmarried. Traditionally, these were seen as both necessary and knowable a priori. Kripke wants to untangle these.
And certainty is different again, right? That's just how sure we feel.
Yeah, certainty is psychological or epistemological too. You might feel certain about something contingent or uncertain about a necessary truth if the proof is complex and you worry you missed something. They're all different concepts.
Okay, keeping those distinctions in mind is key. Then he introduces another pair, rigid and non-rigid designators. This sounds important.
It's absolutely central to his whole positive account of names.
So what's a rigid designator?
A rigid designator is a term, a name, a phrase, whatever, that refers to the very same object in every possible world where that object exists.
Okay.
Example, Kripke's classic example is Richard Nixon. Think about Nixon. Now imagine a possible world where he lost the '68 election to Humphrey.
Okay.
In that world, is the name Nixon still referring to that same guy? the one who in our world was president. Kripke says yes. Even if his life went differently, Nixon still picks out that individual.
The name sticks to the person no matter what counterfactual things happen to them. What's a non-rigid one then?
A non-rigid designator can pick out different things in different possible worlds. Think about the description, the President of the U.S. in 1970.
In our world, that was Nixon.
Right. But in that possible world where Humphrey won in '68, the phrase, the President of the U.S. in 1970, would refer to Humphrey, not Nixon.
Ah, I see. The description latches onto whoever fits the bill in that particular world.
Exactly. And Kripke's huge claim is proper names, like Nixon, Aristotle, London, are rigid designators. Descriptions like the president in 1970 or the teacher of Alexander are often non-rigid.
So Nixon is Nixon in every possible world where he exists. He couldn't have been Humphrey, though Humphrey could have been the president in 1970.
You've got it. This idea of rigid designation makes talking about what might have happened to specific individuals much less confusing. We can track Nixon across different scenarios because the name rigidly points him out.
Are names the only rigid designators?
No, Kripke thinks things like demonstratives, this, that, when used to point something out, are also rigid. If I point to this table and say, this table could have been painted blue, I'm talking about this very table in that other scenario. Variables in logic can also function rigidly.
And when we talk about these possible worlds, we're not discovering alien planets, right?
No. It's more like we're describing alternative scenarios. We stipulate them. And crucially, Kripke thinks these possible worlds aren't just described qualitatively. They often involve the same individuals from our world, just having different properties or doing different things.
Like Nixon losing the election. Same Nixon, different outcome.
Right.
Yep.
And he uses the meter stick example again here. Remember, 1 meter is the length of stick S in Paris at time TO.
The standard meter bar.
He says, okay, that statement might fix the reference of the term 1 meter. It tells us what lengths we're talking about. But is it necessarily true that stick S is 1 meter long?
I guess not. Like, what if it heated up and expanded slightly just after TO? Or it was made slightly imperfectly?
Exactly. Stick S could have been a different length. So the statement used to define 1 meter picks out a certain length rigidly, but it expresses a contingent truth about stick S itself. The stick's length isn't necessary.
Wow. Okay. That definition fixes a reference, but doesn't make the fact about the stick necessary. That really clarifies the difference.
And this whole framework, necessity versus a priori, rigid versus non-rigid, sets Kripke up to launch his main attack on the description theory, especially the cluster version.
Okay, so he's laid the groundwork. Now the critique.
He outlines what he sees as about 6 main theses that typically make up a cluster theory of names. Things like speakers believe the name bearer has certain properties. These properties are supposed to uniquely pick out the referent. The referent is whatever satisfies most of them.
Standard stuff for the theory.
Right. And, crucially, thesis 5, that it's knowable a priori that if the object exists, it has most of these properties. And thesis 6, that it's necessary that if the object exists, it has most of these properties.
The necessity and a priori claims again.
Before attacking these, he mentions condition C, a kind of non-circularity requirement. The properties used in the cluster can't themselves involve the notion of reference in a way that presupposes we already know what the name refers to.
Like defining Socrates as the person called Socrates, that doesn't help identify him.
Exactly, that's circular. Okay, so Kripke goes straight for thesis 6, the necessity claim. Is it necessary that Aristotle had the properties we associate with him, taught Alexander, studied with Plato, etc.?
Seems unlikely. Couldn't he have existed, but, I don't know, become a fisherman instead? Or maybe Plato never took him on as a student?
Kripke thinks absolutely yes. It seems clearly contingent. Aristotle might not have done any of the things he's famous for. So thesis 6, the idea that the main identifying properties are necessary attributes, is just false, according to Kripke. Our theory of names shouldn't make historical achievements necessary truths.
Okay, so necessity is out. What about thesis 5, the a priori knowledge claim? Do we know a priori that if Aristotle existed, he taught Alexander?
Kripke lets this one survive a bit longer, with a qualification. He suggests that maybe it's a priority for a specific speaker, that if the thing they're referring to by Aristotle exists, then it has most of the properties they associate with the name. But this is weaker, and he'll challenge it later too.
All right, so necessity's down, a priori is on shaky ground. What's next?
He goes after thesis 2, the idea that the cluster of descriptions has to uniquely pick out the referent for the name to work.
Does it?
Kripke argues no. Often it doesn't. Think about Cicero. Most people, if pressed, might only know a famous Roman orator.
That's probably not unique. There were likely other famous Roman orators.
Right. Or his example of Richard Feynman. Many people might know the name, know he was a famous physicist, maybe associate him with Caltech or physics diagrams, but do they possess information that uniquely singles him out from all other physicists?
Probably not for the average person using the name, yet we seem to successfully refer to Feynman.
That's Kripke's point. And he brings up the circularity issue again. If you define Cicero as the man who denounced Catiline, you need to know who Catiline is independently.
Which might involve his cluster of descriptions, potentially another circle.
Exactly. Or Einstein as the man who discovered relativity. Well, what's relativity? Einstein's theory. It can quickly become unhelpful. Plus, people often have false beliefs in their cluster, like thinking Einstein worked on the atomic bomb.
Which he famously didn't. He just wrote the letter warning Roosevelt. So the cluster can be non-unique and contain errors, yet we still refer.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Okay, so thesis 2, unique pickout, looks problematic. What about thesis 3? If some object does uniquely satisfy most or all the descriptions in the cluster, is that object necessarily the referent of the name?
So if we find someone who perfectly matches our Aristotle description bundle, that must be Aristotle.
Kripke says no, this is also false. And this leads to one of his most famous thought experiments, Gödel and Schmidt.
Ah, yes, the incompleteness theorem.
Right. Suppose Kripke asks that Kurt Gödel is famous for proving the incompleteness of arithmetic. That's the main thing in most people's Gödel cluster. But imagine secretly it was actually another mathematician, maybe someone named Schmidt, who proved the theorem. Gödel somehow got hold of the manuscript, maybe Schmidt died mysteriously, and Gödel published it under his own name.
Okay, a bit of academic intrigue.
Now, when we use the name Gödel today, talking about the proof, who are we referring to? The description, the man who proved the incompleteness theorem, is uniquely satisfied by Schmidt in this story.
Right, Schmidt fits the description.
But Kripke argues forcefully that when we say Gödel, we are still referring to Gödel, the person we learned the name for, the one associated historically with the theorem, even if our key identifying belief, he proved it, is false and actually applies to Schmidt.
So the reference doesn't automatically shift to whoever fits the description best. It stays with the person the name was originally attached to in the historical chain.
That's the intuition Kripke's pumping. He gives other examples too. Peano is credited with axioms for arithmetic, but maybe Dedekind actually developed them first. Does Peano suddenly refer to Dedekind? Kripke says no.
Or Columbus, we might have lots of false beliefs about him discovering America, thinking he was first, etc. But Columbus still refers to Columbus.
Exactly. The descriptions we associate with a name can be widely inaccurate, and even if someone else perfectly fits those descriptions, the name doesn't automatically latch onto them. Our usage seems tied to a historical individual, regardless of descriptive fit.
Okay, so thesis 3, satisfying descriptions guarantees reference, is out too. What about thesis 4? If no object satisfies the descriptions, does the name fail to refer?
Kripke argues this is also false. Think back to Cicero and Feynman. Even if our knowledge isn't uniquely identifying, violating thesis 2, we still refer. So even if no one perfectly fit the famous Roman orator description uniquely, we'd still be talking about Cicero.
We might just have impoverished knowledge, but the name still works.
Right. Or imagine the Gödel-Schmidt case again. But this time, suppose no one actually proved the incompleteness theorem. Maybe Gödel claimed he did, but it was a mistake or a hoax. Does the name Gödel suddenly become empty, referring to nothing?
It seems like we'd still be talking about Gödel, the person maybe saying Gödel falsely claimed to prove incompleteness.
Kripke agrees. The name can still refer to the individual, even if the associated descriptions fail to pick anyone out, or pick out the wrong person, or are just false. He also uses the example of Jonah.
From the Bible, the whale story.
Yeah. Many biblical scholars might doubt the historical accuracy of the whale story, or even his preaching in Nineveh, so the descriptions might not apply, but they might still believe a prophet named Jonah existed. The name refers even if the main stories, the descriptions, are considered false.
So it looks like all the core theses of the cluster description theory are falling apart under Kripke's analysis.
That's certainly his conclusion. The connection between names and descriptions seems much looser and more complex than those theories allowed.
Which leads him to propose his own alternative, right? The causal theory of names. What does that look like?
It's a very different picture. It starts not with descriptions held by current speakers, but with an initial event. A baptism.
Baptism, like naming a baby.
Sort of, yeah. An object gets its name initially. This could happen through ostension, pointing at something and saying, I'll call that spot.
Pointing and naming.
Or the reference could be fixed by a description, like astronomers noticing perturbations in Uranus's orbit and saying, let's call the planet causing these disturbances Neptune.
Ah, okay. The description helps fix what they're naming, but it isn't the meaning of the name Neptune.
Exactly. That's crucial. The description fixes the reference, but it's not synonymous with the name. Neptune could have existed even if it didn't perturb Uranus. Maybe some other object did. The name Neptune, once fixed, rigidly designates that planet, whatever its actual properties turn out to be.
Okay, so step one is the baptism, fixing the reference. What's step two? How do we get to use the name?
Through a chain of communication. Once an object is named, the name gets passed along from speaker to speaker.
Like a historical chain reaction?
Pretty much. You hear someone use the name Feynman, you then use it yourself, talking to someone else. They use it. The ability for you to refer to Feynman depends on being part of this chain, stretching back ultimately to Feynman himself and the people who knew him and used his name.
Even if I personally know very little about him, like we discussed before.
Exactly. Your reference is secured by your connection to the chain, not by the quality of the description you possess.
Is just being in the chain enough? What if the meaning gets garbled along the way?
Good question. Kripke adds a condition. Speakers in the chain must generally have the intention to use the name with the same reference as the person they heard it from.
An intention to preserve reference.
Right. He gives a funny counterexample. Suppose someone points to an aardvark and says, I'm going to call him Napoleon. Now, there's a causal chain linking this use back to the name of the emperor Napoleon. But the speaker doesn't intend to refer to the emperor when talking about the aardvark. The intention is broken.
Okay. Or maybe the Santa Claus myth. The name might have originally referred to a real St. Nicholas, but the intention behind using Santa Claus today is very different for most people.
That could be another example where the reference might shift or become complex because the intention changes over links in the chain.
So it's baptism, chain of communication, and intention to preserve reference. Is that the whole theory? Like necessary and sufficient conditions?
Kripke is actually quite cautious here. He presents it more as a better picture than a set of strict, exceptionless rules. He quotes Bishop Butler, "Everything is what it is and not another thing." He acknowledges language is messy.
So it's not a formal definition, but a more accurate sketch of how naming seems to work.
Exactly. The picture emphasizes community, history, the transmission of names, and the initial act of linking a name to a thing. Descriptions play a role mainly at the start, in the baptism, or maybe in specific cases like the police needing a temporary tag for an unknown suspect, like Jack the Ripper.
But for established names, the causal chain is primary. Even meeting someone and learning their name, hi, I'm Saul, that's like a mini baptism for you, connecting you to the chain.
That's a good way to put it. It links you into the existing network of reference for that name.
Okay, this causal picture feels quite different, much more grounded in social practice and history. What does it do to those identity statements we talked about earlier?
Right. So identity statements involving descriptions are often contingent. The inventor of bifocals was the first postmaster general. Both descriptions pick out Benjamin Franklin in our world.
But it could have been different. Someone else could have invented bifocals or been postmaster general, so contingent.
Right. But what about identities between names, like Hesperus is phosphorus, or Cicero is Tully, or scientific identities? Water is HO, heat is molecular motion, light is electromagnetic radiation. Are these necessary or contingent?
Traditionally, scientific identities were often seen as contingent, weren't they? Like, we discovered water as HO through experiments. It felt like it could have turned out differently.
Exactly. That was a common view.
Yeah.
And this was used in other areas. For instance, in the philosophy of mind, people argued.
Yeah.
We discover empirically that, say, feeling pain correlates with C fiber stimulation in the brain. Since it's an empirical discovery, the identity pain is C fiber stimulation must be contingent, just like water is HO was thought to be.
Okay, so the contingency of scientific identity was a widely held assumption.
But Kripke, armed with his theory of rigid designators, completely challenges this.
How so?
He says, look, Hesperus is phosphorus. If Hesperus is a rigid designator for the planet Venus, and phosphorus is also a rigid designator for the planet Venus.
Then they both refer to Venus in all possible worlds where Venus exists.
Right. So if they are identical, if Hesperus is phosphorus, which it is, they're both Venus, then that identity statement, Hesperus is phosphorus, must be necessary. It must be true in all possible worlds. Venus is necessarily identical to itself.
Whoa, so even though we discovered it empirically,
The discovery was a posteriori, based on experience. But the truth itself, the identity between the objects designated by these rigid names, is necessary.
so it couldn't have turned out that Hesperus wasn't phosphorus, even though before we found out, it seemed like it could have.
That's the core of his argument. He distinguishes between metaphysical possibility, what could actually be the case, and epistemic possibility, what seems possible given our knowledge. Before the discovery, it was epistemically possible they were different objects. Our evidence could have pointed that way. But metaphysically, if they are in fact the same object, Venus, then they are necessarily the same object.
What about imagining a world where people use the names differently? Like, they call one star Hesperus and a different one Phosphorus.
Kripke says that's irrelevant to the identity in our language. That scenario just describes a world where the sounds Hesperus and Phosphorus refer to different things than they do for us. It doesn't show that our Hesperus, Venus, could have failed to be our Phosphorus, Venus.
It's about the things named, not just the names themselves.
Exactly. And it's contingent that the object Venus appears in the evening, leading to the name Hesperus, and in the morning, leading to Phosphorus. Those are contingent properties Venus has. But the identity of Venus with Venus is not contingent.
So the ways we identify things or the descriptions we use can be contingent, but the underlying identity, if it holds between rigidly designated things, is necessary.
Precisely. This blows up the traditional alignment where necessary always equals a priori and contingent always equals a posteriori. Kripke shows we can have necessary a posteriori truths like Hesperus is phosphorus, or, he argues, scientific identities like water is HO.
And potentially, as with the meter stick, contingent a priori truths, depending on how reference is fixed.
That's another possibility his framework opens up. It really forces a deep rethink of these fundamental categories.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Kripke basically took aim at the dominant idea that names work like descriptions.
Yeah, he argued pretty convincingly against both the simple and the cluster description theories.
And he proposed instead that names are rigid designators. They lock onto an individual across all possible situations.
And that reference works through a causal chain, starting with a baptism and passed down through speakers intending to refer to the same thing.
And this whole picture led him to make that crucial distinction between how we know something, a priori, a posteriori, and whether it has to be true, necessary contingent.
Which resulted in the groundbreaking idea of necessary a posteriori truths, things like scientific identities, which we discover empirically, but which, if true, hold necessarily.
And the implications are pretty huge, right? Especially for science and philosophy of mind.
Absolutely. If identities like water is HO or maybe even pain is C fiber firing are necessary, that changes how we think about the nature of these things and the discoveries we make about them. Are we uncovering necessary features of reality through empirical science? It's a profound question.
It really makes you pause and think about how we use names every single day. Do I really have a cluster of descriptions for everyone I know? Or is it more like Kripke's causal chain? I learn the name and I just use it intending to talk about that person.
Yeah. Does the causal picture resonate more with your intuition about how you learned and used names like Feynman or even the name of your street?
It's fascinating how something seemingly so simple, just naming things, unpacks into these really deep, complex issues about language, knowledge, and reality itself.
It really does. This deep dive into Kripke gives you a powerful lens to reconsider those very foundations. It shows the philosophy packed into the everyday act of using a name.